Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at the Tennison Gambit. Starts out with pawn e4, pawn d5, knight f3. Says, hey, take this pawn if you want to, or if you really wanted to try starting out with knight f3. Same moves, get there a few different ways. Pawn d5 and then pawn to e4. After pawn takes on e4, we're only going to be looking at the accepted lines. It happens almost all the time. Knight to g5. We're not going to get tricky and play knight to g1 or try anything else. Knight here to g5. In this video, we're going to look at the main lines that black may play against this. One you might see is pawn to e5. And this pretty much says, I'm going to give that material right back. I don't know what the hey you're doing with this opening, but I'm not falling for any traps. So go ahead and take that pawn back. I'm going to develop my pieces like I normally would. So that's exactly what you're going to do. You're going to take here on e4, and they could try a couple things. The first thing is to add pressure on this pawn, or this knight right here on e4 with pawn to f5. You're going to bring your knight here to g3. Don't bring it over here to c3. And you bring it back here to g3 because you're kind of hoping that they continue to extend a little bit further than they should with pawn to f4. And players that are not familiar with the Tennison Gambit, specifically on black side, you'll see this often because it doesn't seem too crazy, but you can already sense that the king side of the board is just too open. You could play queen to h5, check, pawn to g6, check. Queen's going to have to come here to e7. We see an exchange on board after the knight takes knight here to e4. And then all of a sudden, white's up in material and has a much better position. Can easily get his light square bishop involved into the game. Castle on the king side, much better setup on board than black has. Now, if we come back and say, instead of pawn to f4, which I think is definitely a mistake, he could play knight to f6. Okay, let's get a little bit more aggressive. Bishop here to c4. We could see knight c6. Pawn d3, get our dark square bishop involved into the game. So this is all in all, pretty solid. Could, even if you wanted to, get his queen involved into the game, start to attack this pawn here on f5 because he has his knight and he potentially could have his queen there. So has some options, but that's how you would approach it. If he instead decides to play knight to c6, I would still do the same thing. Bishop here to c4, continually putting pressure on the square here on f7, and then that's prepping, same thing. Pawn d3, castle on the king side, so you have lots of options. Now, if he doesn't want to add pressure with pawn to f5, he could play knight to f6, and then you could play bishop to b5 check. They could play a knight c6. You could take here after they capture. You could go ahead and take. After the queen takes, you castle on the king side, and I think this is completely fine. You're even in material here because they gave that pawn back to you, and all in all, this is a pretty good structure. They have double pawns here on the c file. They don't have pawns connected to it, so when you get into the end game, white should definitely have a good game here. And if they don't decide to bring their knight to c6, they could try to block it with pawn to c6. I would go ahead and just take the knight here. After the queen takes, you can bring your bishop back here to c4, putting pressure on this f7 square. Then you could castle on the king side, get your queen involved if you wanted to. So lots of different options. That's kind of what happens if they play that just pawn to e5, which says, not really sure exactly what's going on. Go ahead and take that material back if you want to. The next option you may see is pawn to f5. This, I think, is one of the worst ways to respond, but sometimes they try to protect that material any way possible, and a lot of times they try to defend that with pawn. So pawn to f5, I would just start to get really aggressive on board. So bishop to c4, you're kind of setting up this bishop to f7 attack here, and it doesn't really matter that you've given up this pawn. That's why you're playing Gambit. You want to be very, very aggressive. Now, the best move would be knight to h6, protecting the square right here. It is fairly difficult for someone playing this pawn to f5 to find the knight to h6. And besides just defending this square, it's not doing too much on board. And so I would play pawn to d3, and this kind of allows for them to take material and you just continue to get more pieces involved. So if they take right here, I would go ahead and castle on the king side. You don't mind if they continue to take material because you're just looking for them to clear up the board and just have more pieces involved into the attack. So if they take here, you take back with your queen right here. You have your queen attacking this pawn. You have your bishop attacking the square right here. You can easily get your rook involved. Rook over here to e2 or e1. You can get your dark square bishop. So you have a lot of attacks on this board. All in all, I think it's a pretty fun way to play this opening. Now, if they don't play knight to h6, let's say they play pawn to e6. Definitely not the best way for black to respond. But I would continue. Pawn to d3. And then if they take here, you could castle on the king side. Same kind of thing. They don't have to take. Let's say they played knight to c6. I'd still castle on the king side. You don't want to just take here on e4 and then have them come down, exchange queens off the board. You lose a lot of your threat if you give up the queen. Theoretically, if you run it through a chess engine, it might say, yeah, it's fine, give up the queens, but that's not why you're playing the Tennison Gambit. You want more active pieces, very strong pieces on board. So definitely make sure you're castling on the king side. You want them to be taking with their pawn, and from there, deciding how you want to continue. Now, they could, instead of pawn to e6, let's say they want to get their queen involved. So queen down here to d4. I want to attack the bishop here. I want to start to try to attack some other squares on the board. Okay, don't even worry about that. Recognize that you still have that threat on f7. You're always going to be looking at that. Anytime you have your bishop here on c4, you're always going to be looking for an opportunity to come here to f7. So then king here to d8, and then pawn to d3. And this is a great position for white. You have some very active pieces. The king on d8 is not going to be able to castle. So all in all, very good position from white. Now, instead of defending with their pawn, they may decide to go and get pretty aggressive and play queen to d5, protecting it with their queen. Play pawn to d3. We've kind of seen this move before. If they decide to take, you could play knight here to c3. Or you could play bishop takes here on d3. I really like bishop takes on d3 because it does give them an opportunity to make a mistake of queen down here to g2. And if they play queen to g2, then bishop to e4, and the queen is going to fall. The queen is trapped. He can no longer get out of this. And so that's why I like playing that bishop here to d3. It also has a discovered attack depending on where the queen may move to. Bishop up here to b7, and then the queen could potentially fall depending on where it is or how the board is progressing. If we come back a little bit and say, we take here on d3, the queen doesn't take on g2, because that would be a mistake. If they play knight to f6, I would just castle on the king side, continue with our development. If they were to play queen to e5, that's fine. Bishop here to e3, you have both your bishops here. You can castle on the king side if you want to. All in all, I think this is going to be a pretty good position from white. Now, coming back here, they don't have to take the pawn here on d3. They could decide to play knight to f6, adding more defenders on the square in the center of the board. I would just go ahead and play knight to c3. This is going to just kind of gain a tempo on the board. You're trying to, when you give up that pawn and material for a gambit, you're trying to get something in return, usually a strong attack. Knight to c3 does a few things. One, it attacks the square here on e4, but it does kick this queen back that's currently on d5. So after c3, you could see queen to d8. And then I would just go ahead and take with the knight on e4. You're going to have this material. He's not really going to take. I think if he takes, that's probably bad, just because now you control the center of the board. He doesn't have anything on board right now as far as development, so I think this is going to be a pretty good position from white. Next one we'll look at is bishop here to f5. And this is one of the first times where you'll see me play knight to c3. Now, some commentary might say pawn to g4. I think this is a fairly bad move. I don't like blowing up my king side. I like playing pretty aggressive with the gambit, but I don't think you have to play pawn to g4. I would just play knight to c3. I think it does exactly what you're trying to do. Be pretty aggressive, control the center of the board with your knights right now, and just let them know that you can keep adding defenders to this pawn, but eventually it is going to fall, or you're just going to be put in a really bad position. After you played knight to c3, you might see knight to f6, simple development move, and then continue pawn to d3. If they take here, this is one of the first times where I would change it up. I'd play queen to f3. And this is where it gets tricky, because once this light square bishop's out, the queen here on f3 can start to attack this undefended square here on b7. So if they play pawn here to e6, then you're taking here on b7. If they come back and let's say they don't take with their pawn on d3, let's say they instead play knight to c6. Okay, you can just go ahead and take here on e4, and then if they want to exchange on board, that's fine. Eventually they could exchange if they want to. That's just par for the course. That's going to happen. All in all, I still think this is pretty good. It's not nearly as bad to lose the right to castle once the queens are off the board, because at that particular time you're going to be getting your king in the center of the board, and you have a double bishop pair. You can easily keep the board fairly open. So all in all, I think this is going to be pretty good. So we'll come back to the beginning when we played the knight to c3 at the beginning. Instead of knight to f6, they could play knight to c6. I would play bishop to c4. I always like to get the bishop over here to c4 in this position when you have the knight on g5. It just makes sense. You have two attackers on the square. This knight's doing double duty as far as attacking the pawn and the pawn up here on f7. And so really, depending on what they do, if they're playing knight to f6, they always have to worry about that threat. Bishop here to f7 is just deadly for black. So, they don't have tons of great options. They're going to be continuing with the same amount of stuff. The bishop on f5 is really just playing defense. If they were to play pawn to e6, you can go ahead and castle. You could play pawn to d3, which we've seen before, get the dark square bishop involved into the game. So right now, that they're not really getting their board state where they should. Instead, they're just somewhat playing defense. So if their knight doesn't come to c6, maybe they play queen down here to d4, adding more defenders on the square right here. I would continue pawn here to d3 and then just see what they play. Next, what you could see is knight to f6. And when I've played this quite often, I see knight to f6 more than any other move, because it makes a lot of sense from anyone that's not too familiar from black's side. In the Tennison Gambit, they play a development move, controls the center of the board, and this pawn right here on e4. Now, there's two ways for white to attack it. Usually, I would recommend just bishop here to c4, attacking the pawn here on f7. But after e6, there's just not a lot of good continuation that I think on board. And this bishop here on c4 doesn't have a strong attack for the rest of the game, depending on how your opponent plays. Instead, I like to continue with knight to c3, adding more attackers right away on this pawn here on e4. They could continue bishop f5, adding another defender right here, and then you're going to be playing that pawn to d3. If they take here, that's where we get back into that queen to f3. Anytime you see the light square bishop come out, you're going to be looking for that queen here to f3. You also have the option of taking with your bishop here, but I like to go ahead and bring the queen out here to f3. Now, if they don't bring the bishop out and says, I don't want that queen to come out, so instead I'm just going to continue with knight to c6, that's fine. Now you can go ahead and play bishop to c4 if you want to. And if we see pawn to e6, not the best scenario, because I just don't think you have as strong attacks, but castle on the king side. And then if you want to continue with pawn to d3 a little bit later on, you can. The last variation we're going to look at is the knight coming here to c6. And I see this sometimes in players. I feel like they just don't know what to do with this pawn. So they say, I'm not even going to try to defend it. I'm going to go ahead and continue to do my thing on the queen side of the board. I'm going to let you recapture, and then we'll kind of go from there. I don't actually like to recapture. Knowing that white's going to get this material back, I want to give them more opportunities to try to hold on to it. So I'm going to play knight to c3, hoping that they say, okay, you're going to attack these with your knights. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and play pawn to f5, try to hold on to this. Say, hey, that's fantastic. That's what I want. Now I can play my bishop to c4. Lots of pressure over here on the king side. And we've kind of looked at before, if the pawn's here on f5, you just have lots of strong attacks. You can castle on the king side. And then you can play your pawn here to d3. And they just kind of have a weak king side defense over here. Now, instead, if they don't play this pawn to f5, they could just continue their pawn to e5, saying, yep, I've already given up on that pawn, not even thinking about it. That's where you can get into your pawn here to d3. And then if they take, say, I'll just go ahead and get material back as much as possible because I thought that pawn was already gone. You can play bishop here to d3. And then you have 3 minor pieces involved into the game. This dark square bishop is protecting this knight right here. You can castle on the king side and start to put a lot of pressure on your opponent. So that's some of the lines that you could see in the Tennison Gambit. What I like about it is it's very common for you to actually play this. You don't require a lot of moves for your opponent. A lot of people will play that pawn to e4 and their opponents come back with pawn here to d5. You can immediately just play knight to f3 and get into that opening. So try this out. Let me know what you guys think. Clearly, if black plays correctly, they're going to have a very strong game. But white has so many ways to attack that I think they're going to have a pretty good game if their opponent's not familiar with it. So everyone, thanks for watching another video on Fun Gambit, and I'll see you guys in the next video.